Let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a musician and a computer scientist? Now, I know this sounds like the setup to a terrible joke, but I am genuinely looking for an answer because it seems that the more I try to search for one, the more I end up finding these deep rooted and unexpected similarities instead. And as somebody with a burning passion for both music and computer science, making this talk felt like I was not quite pulling together the two sides of who I was, but rather discovering how closely related they were already. So today, I gladly welcome you to the field of music, computer science, and everything in between. So, sometime between crying baby and edgy teenager, my mom signed me up for piano lessons and a basic course on the Python programming language. And sometime between that and this TEDx talk, I became immersed in the world of competitive programming and music composition. As I developed my proficiency in both of these disciplines, I began to notice how transferable certain skills or ways of thinking were between them. And the first of these, which I would like to highlight, is what I call structuring and patterning. So I define structuring to be the skill required to be able to build something complex from a set of simple parts, while patterning is the opposite, being able to break down something complex into more manageable pieces. So to review, structuring is for building up and patterning is for breaking down. Let's look at some examples. In music composition, you have to constantly ask yourself how the next piece of the puzzle fits into everything you've already written. For instance, what should the next note in this melody be so that it sounds the most natural? What counter melodies or harmonies could I add to complement this melody? And what instrument should play it? Or even, how could I reuse a theme or leitmotif throughout a larger musical work, say a film score, to express a particular emotion or represent a certain character or recurring idea? Similarly, in computer science, you constantly have to ask yourself how the next line of code fits into everything you've already written. Also, you may have heard that all data represented by computers eventually reduces down to zeros and ones. And that's true, which is why it's so important for computer scientists to understand how to make that reduction, but also how to build up text, images, audio, video, or any real world data for that matter from nothing but those zeros and ones. Finally, in computer science, a common piece of advice you might hear is never write the same code twice. This is because you can put duplicate code into what's called a function, and a function can be easily reused throughout a larger program in much of the same way that a leitmotif could be used throughout a larger musical work. So everything is just structuring and patterning to some extent. Perhaps my favorite example of patterning in music is chopping samples in music production. This is when you take an audio sample, slice it up into a bunch of pieces, and then rearrange or combine those pieces in new and interesting ways. So here is an example of a piano where every single note on the piano has been replaced with a piece of the original piano melody. Okay, yeah. So you can base an entire song around this kind of thing. Some of your favorite songs might do this by taking samples from very other old songs. And I think uh, the main idea behind this is that every single slice can be treated almost like a function in computer science, but instead of holding a block of code, it holds a block of music. Secondly, because the skills of structuring and patterning are so transferable, is there really anything stopping us from, say, taking the tools of computer science and applying them to make music, or vice versa? No, nothing is stopping us. So here's an example of music generated completely with code and a bit of knowledge from your average high school functions course. Yeah, so what I did there is I started out by making basic sounds such as the saw wave. As you can see, it was just your standard line y equals mx, but I chop it up into a bunch of pieces so that it becomes a zigzag. And then for the kick and snare drums, I can use white noise or a sine wave, a squash sine wave. And then I reuse those as functions at different points in time, quite similarly to that previous example. Finally, this slide is for my fellow musical computer science nerds in the audience. If you don't understand anything on the slide, it's okay because it's just a fun fact. Anyway, Western music notation is Turing complete. What that means is Western music notation can do anything that a modern computer can, provided that whoever's performing your music has a lot of patience and perfect memory. And so here's an example. Here on the slideshow, I've shown a couple of equivalents from programming to music, such as for loops being repeat, the if statement being voltas or first and second endings, go to being ds al coda, like jumping to the sign, dal segno, and printing simply music itself. And there is an example of a half adder implemented in Western music notation. Ultimately, my point is that music and computer science are simply manifestations of the same set of skills, just applied in different contexts. And perhaps more importantly, those aren't the only two contexts where these skills can be applied. When you're doing any kind of work at all, it's always helpful to break things down into smaller steps. That way, at each one of those steps, you can focus on making simple contributions to a larger project rather than tackling it all at once. Take the visual artist, for example. They understand how to break down complex forms into fundamental shapes, lines, and curves. Or consider the basketball player. They can build up a strong defense and offense from the fundamental skills of dribbling, passing, and shooting. Or consider the mathematician. They can build deep theorems from nothing but the bare bone basic facts. Or consider the TEDx speaker who breaks their presentation into multiple sections so that the audience can pick up on the main points. Everything is just a matter of building up, breaking down, structuring, and patterning. And speaking of sections, let's move on to the next one. The next similarity I would like to highlight between music and computer science is simply creative thinking or the creative process. I'm personally still trying to improve my music production skills, and I think what's helped me the most so far is to avoid doing the same thing over and over again. That way, I get to explore and expand my skill set beyond the things I'm comfortable with. Similarly, the most important thing to do when approaching a difficult problem in competitive programming is to not get stuck in one approach. The worst thing you can do is convince yourself that you found a solution when you really haven't. That can be a major roadblock on the path to success. The best advice I have for getting into any creative field at all is quantity over quality. You might have saw it over here. Yeah, quantity over quality. Now, people often say quality is better than quantity, but I'd argue that when you're just starting out, you have no idea what quality even is. It's better to just make as many bad ideas as possible than to be stuck in the delusion that you should spend all your effort on the first idea you come up with. Of course, it's still important to put some amount of effort into each idea you create to gauge how much potential they might have, but I think in general, people give quantity less credit than it deserves. Oftentimes, quality is what emerges as a result of exploring the possibilities, and I think more people need to recognize that. Okay, now we get to the examples. So when I work on a music production project, it goes through several phases. So the first half, I'd say, I get to apply my structuring and patterning skills to create those fun little melodies you saw before. But then in the later phases, it becomes strikingly similar to debugging a piece of code. I have to constantly be listening for harshness and dissonances in the music, little seams, and chase them down with many, many little tweaks. And it gets quite exhausting. So as a result, I have several folders filled with up to 15 drafts of a single song. And I have file names like final or final and version 2.15 or something. Secondly, when I make problems for competitive programming contests, I begin by writing down as many ideas as possible, even if it's just a cool title idea, because you never know how much potential a few words can have when you look back at them. And guess what? This TEDx talk itself has gone through 10 drafts as well. And I'm probably still gonna look back at this one day and hope I said something different. And that's okay, because we have to embrace imperfection, because if we didn't, nothing would ever get done. Finally, I want to remind you all that it's always possible to go back to those bad ideas and breathe some newfound life into them once you have more experience. For example, I've been working on remastering and remaking some of my older songs. And in competitive programming, I often go back to proms I failed in contests over 2 years ago and finally finish my revenge arc when I finally complete that problem. So by now, I hope that you can see that creativity is not an inherent skill that only some people have. Rather, it's characterized by hours and hours of work and finding as many possible approaches to a problem as possible so that the most unique and innovative ideas come out on top. I hope this talk encourages you to consider how the skills of structuring and patterning, as well as creative thinking, might fit into your own lives, and how they might connect the many disciplines you might be involved in. Finally, I want to address the elephant in the room: artificial intelligence. It's definitely already replacing some computer scientists, and it's also somehow beginning to replace some musicians as well. There have been instances of completely AI-generated music becoming scarily popular on platforms like Spotify. Perhaps AI is the most relevant example of quantity over quality in our modern day. They were literally trained on billions and billions of existing ideas for the purpose of predicting that next piece of the next word in a piece of text, or the next line of code, or the next note in a melody, or the next reel you might enjoy watching. And so if I continue on my passion of music and computer science, am I just taking an accelerated course to unemployment? No. I firmly believe that if anybody is still thriving even after AI has taken over many jobs, it will be the creatives, the people who can always find a way forward, even if they trip up along the way, like I may have done during this presentation. I believe that it will be the creatives who will continue to push arts and technology into the future. And so while a hardworking person might climb 40 flights of stairs to achieve their goals, a person who is both hardworking and creative will spend their time inventing the elevator and changing the world. So I encourage all of you to keep being creative and keep exploring those interdisciplinary connections that nobody else will. Thank you for listening to my TEDx talk.